Hello guys, today we are going to do something a little bit out of ordinary, at least for this channel. We're going to review a lens. And no, it's not what you're thinking. I'm not going to become one of those reviewing channels, but I kind of felt the need to review this one because it is an interesting piece of equipment, and I did get into vintage lenses recently, so 6 months ago. I got curious and I wanted to experiment, and it was really cheap, and I will get to that, but it was really cheap and I tried it and I don't regret it. So yeah, I felt the need to review it, and it is not going to be a super technical review. I'm not a reviewer, I'm not a gear guy, I don't get technical stuff that much. It is going to be less of a review and more of how I felt using this lens, why I like this lens, why I dislike this lens, and so on and so forth. So in this review I'm going to talk about why would you buy this lens, where would you buy this lens, how would you adapt this lens to your modern DSLR camera, and also of course I'm going to talk about the physical attributes of this lens and its performance. So shall we go on? So the biggest question we face is, why would you buy this lens and why would you use this lens? When you compare this lens with the modern lenses that cost thousands upon £1,000, and this one costs just £60, why would this one be a good investment? Well, why not? When you consider that the glass in lenses hasn't changed that much since 50 years ago, and the improvements are mostly in autofocus, auto stabilization and weatherproofing, you think about it and you say, well, if I can get really sharp images and really nice images with this lens, why wouldn't I use it? For an amateur or a hobbyist, why not? And the second question would be, where would you buy this lens or other vintage lenses? So all sorts of places. One place does come to mind, and it is eBay. And yes, it is better than your local camera shop because you have just larger variety of these lenses and you have just cheaper prices, I guess. And it really depends where you live. If you are in the US, you will find really cheap options for this one. You can find this one for as little as maybe $20, $30. But here in the UK, I found this one for £60, which is a bargain. At least for something you get. You get a really good lens for £60, and I'm happy with this. So we figured out why and where, but now we have to find out how. As I said, you can adapt vintage lenses, most of vintage lenses, to most of DSLR cameras. It is not a big problem. Mounting technology of these lenses, I mean engineering, is not that much difference from your average Coca-Cola bottle. It is a screw-on lens, and it means it just screws on to your camera. And most of vintage lenses have an M42 mount. So I don't know what that means, but it is an M42 mount. But when I was researching for this particular lens, it turns out this one is an M39 lens, which is a bit different. I guess it's smaller. And yes, when I was buying this, I didn't do that much research. I just bought the lens and I bought the adapter. So this small one, M39, which turned out to be useless.
Yes, it's in focus now.
I went outside, I adapted this adapter to this lens and to my camera. It all fit perfectly, but when I tried to focus, when I tried to use the lens, it just didn't work. It just couldn't focus. I then went back home. I was quite sad, disappointed. I returned the lens to the seller and he was really cool about it. And he said, okay, send it back. I'll try to fix it. Maybe it's broken. But turns out it wasn't broken. The lens was perfectly fine. And he says, no, doesn't matter, I can return your money and that will be the end of story. But then I felt kind of embarrassed. I felt like a proper amateur. And then I did research, which I should have done prior. I did research and it turns out that this lens only works with an M42 adapter. So when you're buying this, of course, you're gonna have an M42 to your specific mount, your specific camera mount. So mine is FX, so M42 to FX. Anyways, it worked with M42, but of course it's too big for the M42 unless you buy this little thing, this little ring, which is an M39 to M42 adapter. And I tested the lens and it worked. It focused perfectly. The pictures looked really amazing. And why did this work? Well, I don't know. I'm not a lens guy. I can't explain, but it just did work, and I'm grateful for it. And I'm grateful for the seller. And if you want to buy this lens, I'm gonna link him down below because he was so cool while handling the whole situation. And this finally brings us to the actual review of the lens, where I talk about its physical attributes and its performance. Well, first I'm going to describe the lens. It is a very peculiar looking lens, and that's why I kind of bought it. I'm a big aesthetic. I like stuff that looks special and unique. So yeah, it really drew me in and I bought this lens because it looks like some kind of a Russian rocket with this chrome finish. When you're looking at it on a computer screen, it looks kind of larger. It was smaller than I expected. Also, it weighed less than you assume. So you assume, this is a big piece of steel, it's gonna be very heavy, but it is not heavy at all. So the first thing that we notice with this lens is this made in USSR sign. It's really funny. And you have two aperture rings and one focusing ring. The first aperture ring brings you from its maximum aperture of 4 to its minimum of 22. It's kind of stuck now, no? And yeah, you're not gonna really use these bigger numbers. You're gonna stick to 4 and 5.6 because you really want to use that bokeh that this lens provides you with. Then you have this second aperture ring that brings you to these middle distances between 4 and 5.6, between 5.6 to 8, which I was a bit confused when I first got the lens because I'm not really used to these manual lenses that are all, I mean, as I said, I'm not a big gear guy, I'm not a big tech guy. Anyways, next thing you see is this focusing ring, which shows the distance in meters, and Also, one annoying thing about this is that when you adapt the lens fully, you will never have this little red line that was supposed to be centered in your camera. You're never gonna see this in the middle. It's always gonna go to the left or a little bit to the right. So if you are a very perfectionist person, you won't like it, but I really don't give a... Yeah, so another really funny physical aspect of this lens is that it has this orangey hue when you look at it from a certain angle, and that is because of a particular element that you can find in this lens, I mean in the glass, and it is thorium. And thorium is highly radioactive. So when I say this, I'm not a scientist, I don't know, but you can always do your own research. I have this guy that I follow, Kenny from Kentucky, with his channel, which I will link down below. He reviews these lenses and he's much more knowledgeable than I, and he talks about radioactivity in these lenses, and he compares it to getting a full body scan if you if you use this lens every day. Body scan a week, he says, but you know, you won't use it so often, I guess, so shouldn't worry about it too much. And finally then, as I said, finally we get to see the performance of this lens. The best way to show you is to preview some images. So the images you are seeing right now is from the week I first got it. They were shot in the daytime, which is really good because you can see the specific colors you get with this lens. You get to see these warm images that are, I guess, the product of the orange tint that the lens naturally has. The hue is also more towards the greenish side of the spectrum. And the images you're seeing right now are from my most recent shoot with this lens. Is about a couple of weeks ago when I went out at night, and you can see that you can really get a good night performance with this lens, as it has a maximum aperture of 4. Also, I have to say, I'm not used to shooting with a 135mm lens, so you can see that the image is a little bit different than my usual style. I decided to do some completely candid portraits of people in office buildings and buses on the street, because you just can when you have this lens, as opposed to when you're shooting with something a bit more wide. You can really get a nice close-up images from people that are relatively far away. And last but not least, the most significant project actually I did while using this lens was the 135 project. It is the time when I did 135 portraits during a week period. It was loads of fun. If you want to see a video about that, I will link it. If you are too lazy to see the whole video, I have a reel with a compilation of all the images I took. So finally, in summation, what do I think? What do I think about this lens? I think it's just amazing. And if you're even a little bit curious about it, you should buy it, because it is a no-brainer. It's really cheap, and you will learn something new, and you will have this piece of history which you just kind of feel special with this lens. And another thing about this lens is it is a natural conversation starter. I had so many people on the street ask me, I mean usually some photographer geeks, it's never like a nice looking girl, but in all seriousness, I met some people while using this lens, and it is a really nice feeling when you bond with someone on the street just because you have this interesting lens. Anyways, should you buy it? Yes, If you're not interested, just don't buy it. And I hope you enjoyed this review. It is my first review. Maybe I'll do another one in a couple of years, who knows. But yes, if you want to support the channel, subscribe, like the video, share the video. I love you, and goodbye.